They handed me a notice at 6:12 a.m. and said I had 14 hours to erase my life, pack everything I owned, abandon the house I legally bought, and disappear before midnight, or they would remove me. What they didn't know was that by sunrise the next day, the same HOA that tried to evict me would be fighting to save itself from total collapse. If you love shocking HOA revenge stories where arrogance meets ironclad law, hit subscribe now, because this one escalates fast, and every twist is real enough to hurt. The knock came before my coffee finished brewing, a sharp, official pounding that carried the kind of confidence only people with borrowed power ever seem to have. And when I opened the door there stood 3 figures in matching navy blazers embroidered with the silver crest of the Brookstone Ridge Homeowners Association, flanked by a uniformed sheriff's deputy who wouldn't meet my eyes, and the woman in the center, Marilyn Huxley, HOA president for the last 9 years, smiled like she was about to give me a gift instead of ruin my life as she handed me a thick envelope and announced, loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, that I had 14 hours to pack all my belongings and vacate the premises because I was being evicted for egregious and ongoing violations, a phrase that echoed in my ears as I scanned the first page and felt my hands go cold, because the notice claimed my house had been improperly occupied, my property rights suspended, and enforcement action approved unanimously by the board, effective immediately, and when I demanded to know how a private HOA thought it could evict me from a home I owned free and clear, Marilyn tilted her head and said, "You should have read the bylaws before you bought," which was rich considering I had read them, memorized them, and even laughed at how often they contradicted state law, but none of that mattered in that moment because the deputy cleared his throat and said his role was simply to keep the peace if I became non-compliant, and suddenly my quiet morning turned into a public spectacle as doors opened up and curious neighbors stepped onto porches, whispering, filming, judging, and that was when Marilyn raised her voice and announced I was being removed for refusing to pay newly assessed community usage fees, and for constructing an unauthorized structure, meaning the small workshop I had built behind my house, a workshop that sat entirely within my surveyed boundaries and had been approved by the county months earlier, but Marilyn waved that away and said HOA approval superseded county permits, which was false, laughably false, but she said it with such authority that several neighbors nodded along, and when I told her she had no legal authority to evict me, she leaned closer and whispered that if I wasn't gone by midnight, the HOA would seize my belongings under abandonment provisions and change the locks, and then she smiled again and walked away, leaving the deputy behind long enough to quietly say, "You might want to talk to a lawyer," before following them back to the sidewalk, and for a few minutes I just stood there, staring at the paper that said my life fit neatly into 14 hours, but then something inside me snapped into focus, not panic, not fear, but clarity, because Marilyn had made one fatal mistake. She assumed I was just another homeowner who would fold under pressure, pack boxes, and leave quietly, and she didn't know that I had bought that house as part of a larger land acquisition, that my property predated the HOA by decades, that my deed included easements the HOA depended on, and that my day job for the last 12 years had been resolving property disputes that ended in court judgments people studied in law school. So instead of packing, I sat down, opened my laptop, and started making calls, the first to my attorney, who laughed when I read him the notice and said, "They did what?" The second to the county recorder, who confirmed in writing that my lot was never legally annexed into the HOA, and the third to a title insurance officer who pulled my file and reminded me that the HOA used access roads crossing my land under a revocable easement granted by a previous owner, an easement that could be terminated for harassment or interference, and as the hours ticked by and the sun climbed higher, I watched Marilyn and her board members strut around the neighborhood like they already owned my house, measuring my driveway, photographing my windows, telling neighbors I'd be gone by morning, and around noon they returned with a moving company truck they claimed was on standby, a blatant intimidation tactic, and that was when I invited them onto my porch, handed Marilyn a freshly printed document, and told her she might want to read it carefully, because it was a notice of immediate termination of the access easement across my property, effective at midnight, meaning every HOA-maintained road leading to Brookstone Ridge would legally become landlocked, emergency access included, and when Marilyn scoffed and said that wasn't possible, I showed her the county seal and the recorded reference number, and for the first time her smile flickered, but she recovered quickly and said the HOA's attorneys would crush me, that I was making a huge mistake, and that I still had 6 hours left to comply, so I let her talk, because I knew what was coming next, and right on schedule, at 3:47 p.m., the sheriff's deputy returned, alone this time, with a different expression on his face, asked to speak with Marilyn, and quietly informed her that the county had received multiple complaints about HOA overreach, that eviction authority rested solely with the courts, and that he would not be assisting with any removal, seizure, or lock change, and the color drained from Marilyn's face as neighbors leaned in closer, sensing a shift, but she doubled down, shouting that the HOA board had emergency powers, that she'd seen it done before, and that I was manipulating technicalities, which was when my attorney arrived in person, shook the deputy's hand, and asked Marilyn if she'd like to explain to the crowd why she was issuing unlawful eviction notices and impersonating legal authority, because those were criminal matters, not civil ones. And suddenly the narrative flipped. Neighbors who had been whispering about my violations started whispering about Marilyn's behavior. Someone pulled out their phone and started a live stream, and as if that wasn't enough, a county inspector pulled up to examine the HOA's stormwater retention system, a system that sat partially on my land without a valid permit, a system I had tolerated until that morning. And by early evening, what was supposed to be my forced move out had turned into a full-blown HOA crisis, with board members arguing openly on the sidewalk, Marilyn screaming into her phone at the HOA's attorney, and neighbors demanding answers about fines they'd paid for years that might not have been legal at all. And when midnight came, I was still sitting in my living room, eating takeout, while Marilyn sat in her car across the street, crying, because she had just learned that the emergency meeting she called resulted in a vote to suspend her pending investigation, that the HOA's insurance carrier had been notified of potential fraud, and that the access easement termination meant the HOA had exactly 30 days to renegotiate with me or face regulatory action for unsafe access. And in the days that followed, the story spread beyond the neighborhood, uncovering a pattern of intimidation, selective enforcement, and fabricated authority that went back years, leading to Marilyn's resignation, the board's restructuring, refunds to homeowners, and a formal acknowledgement, recorded, notarized, and framed on my wall, that my property was never subject to HOA control. And the greatest twist of all was that the same neighbors who watched me get evicted at dawn showed up a month later with apologies, baked goods, and quiet gratitude, because my refusal to pack up my life in 14 hours forced an abusive system into the light, proving that sometimes the fastest way to lose everything is to assume the person you're bullying doesn't know the law, and sometimes the most powerful move you can make when someone tells you to leave your own home is to sit down, read carefully, and let them destroy themselves instead.